Listen. Can you hear it? Listen closer. You're in the mountains, and the spirits are with us. That's not the wind, but it's the spirits. And the spirits are still telling the stories. And if you're really listening, these are just a few that you will hear. Grandfather Coyote, who was looking at the sky one night, and he saw a beautiful star. It's the star we know today as the North Star. He called out to the beautiful star and asked her to bring him into the sky so they could dance together. But the beautiful North Star would not speak to Grandfather Coyote. The next night, Grandfather climbed up to a hill, and once again he called out to the beautiful North Star, asked her to bring him into the sky so they could dance together. And he said he wanted to dance with her forever across the universe. But still, Grandfather Coyote did not get any attention from the beautiful North Star. So on the third night, Grandfather Coyote climbed up to a mountain. And once again, he called out to the beautiful North Star, asked her to bring him into the sky so they could dance together forever across the universe. And then he told her that he loved her, that she was so beautiful. But still, the North Star would not speak to Grandfather Coyote. On the fourth night, Grandfather Coyote climbed up to the top of Mount Hood. And there, standing on that peak, he'd reach out and almost touch her. But still, she was just a little bit too far away. Once again, he asked her to bring him into the sky so they could dance forever across the universe. He told her that he loved her, that she was so beautiful. And this time, he said something that really caught her ears. He said that he wanted to make her his wife. And this time, she started listening to him. The more the four-legged spoke, the more infatuated she became of him. And so she reached down and pulled him to the sky. And they began to dance around the top of Mount Hood. They danced and danced and danced and danced. And then she took him higher into the sky, and higher and higher and higher, until all of a sudden, Grandfather Coyote became very cold. And he looked down and he realized he had never been so far away from his earth as he was at this very moment. And he turned to the North Star and asked her that they could maybe stop their dancing, because he was very, very tired, and he could use some rest. But she would not stop dancing, because he had told her he wanted to take her. He wanted her to dance with him forever across the universe. And so she took him higher and higher and higher and higher into the sky until they reached the very top of the universe. And then she vanished and left Grandfather Coyote all alone. Grandfather Coyote was afraid. He called out to the other stars and said, "Help him." He wanted to go back to his earth, but they would not help him. And so he complained and complained and complained. And finally, they grew tired of listening to him, and they decided, yes, they would indeed send him back to his precious earth. But this time, he would not go back as a four-legged. He would go back as a falling star. And so they grabbed him, and they hurled him down towards the earth. He went faster and faster and faster, and then he crashed into the earth, leaving a huge hole. All the other coyotes, they heard the commotion. They went running, and there they found this giant hole, and at the very bottom of it was their Grandfather Coyote. And they all began to cry, and their tears, they filled this huge hole, and it became a lake. And it's a lake today we know as Crater Lake. And they say the reason why the coyotes still cry to the sky at night, that they are calling out to that beautiful North Star and pleading with her not to bring them into the sky and dance with them, because they do not want to come back as a falling star. And how do we know that the story is true? Because the old people have told us so. That story was given to me by an incredible man who I'll never forget, Wilfred Yallop from the Yakima Indian Nation. And when he gave me that story, he kind of chuckled and he said, "When I am gone, you will always remember me And I don't remember him just because of that story. I remember him from many things. But yes, every time I do that story, it's in his memory. Storytelling has always been passed on. Without people sitting down and listening and learning the stories, they will disappear. And the Indian people have made sure that these stories do not forever vanish. And I have a story I need you to help me with. It's a story that throughout the Northwest, many versions of this story is told. In fact, some people say there are thousands, if not more. This is a story about Raven in the light. Now, every time I raise my talking stick, do exactly as Raven does. Now, remember, when I raise my talking stick, do as Raven does. Someone stole the sun from the sky. It was an evil shaman. He took that ball of light from the sky and brought it into his lodge, and he hid it in the bentwood box. And the world turned eternal black. The animals and people could not hunt or fish. They could not gather from the land. The great hawks and eagles could not fly across the sky. The only thing that was moving was the bats and the owls. And they became very tired, having to fly forever through this eternal night. So they went to Raven, a bird that has magical powers, and they asked him if he could not rescue the sun and bring it back to the world. Now, Raven knew he could probably do it, but he had to find the lodge of that shaman and figure a way to get inside, some way that would not make him suspicious. So he perched himself on a tree by this evil shaman's lodge, and he waited. And he realized that every day at a certain time, the beautiful daughter of the shaman would walk out of the lodge with a wooden cup. She would go down to a nearby stream, dip it in, and take a drink. Raven had a plan. The next day, when the woman left the lodge, he turned himself into a little tiny needle off of a cedar tree. He dropped down into the water, and when she dipped her cup into the stream, he floated inside. And when she took a drink, Raven, who was disguised as that little tiny needle from the cedar tree, slipped down her throat. And 9 months later, Raven was born. Now, the old shaman looked at Raven, thought he looked mighty peculiar for a baby, but he still welcomed him into his household. And Raven was a good baby, except for one problem. One big problem. All he would do was all day and night was, wah! So what would Raven do? Wah! But the shaman, he had dealt with many babies in his lifetime, and he thought all Raven wanted was some salmon. So he went into his storehouse and pulled out these great big pieces of Chinook salmon, baked it just perfectly over the fire, and then he gave it to Raven. And Raven ate all he wanted. And when he was finished, what did Raven do? Wah! Well, Raven really didn't want just salmon. He wanted something else. He decided roots. So once again, he went to his storehouse, pulled out some roots and baked it just perfectly over the fire. Gave it to Raven, and after Raven had eaten, what did he do? Wah! Huckleberries. That's what Raven really wanted, thought the old man. Everything loved huckleberries, those tiny blueberries that grow high in the mountains. So he went to his storehouse and pulled out these great big baskets made from the bark of the cedar bark that was filled with huckleberries. He gave the 4 baskets to Raven, and he ate all he wanted. And then what did Raven do in appreciation? The old man didn't know what to do. Raven certainly wasn't hungry. Magic! That's what Raven wanted, thought the old man. He wanted something magical. So he went into his things and pulled out his best deer hoof rattle. And he gave it to Raven. And Raven shook it. And he shook it again. And he shook it again. And again. And then what did Raven do in appreciation? The shaman was giving up. He didn't know what Raven wanted. He didn't want salmon. He didn't want roots. He didn't want huckleberries. He didn't even want his magic rattle. All he wanted to do was cry. And then the shaman realized that ever since Raven had been born, for 4 long days and nights, he had not checked on the sun hidden in the bentwood box. And so while Raven was doing what? Wah! He walked through the noisy household, cracked open the box. Light filled the room, and what did Raven do? Nothing. For the first time, Raven shut his mouth. And the old guy realized that all Raven wanted was the sun. So he took out the sun from the bentwood box and gave it to Raven. Raven rolled it along the floor like it was a ball. And after only a few minutes, the shaman picked up the sun and returned it to the safety of the bentwood box. Finally, he could get some sleep. But the next morning, what was he greeted with by Raven? Wah! And immediately the old man took the sun out of the box and gave it to Raven. And that's the way it was. Every time Raven began to cry, he got the sun. As time passed, Raven could go into that bentwood box by himself and take out the sun and play with it, but always it was under the watchful eye of the shaman. Well, 7 long months passed, and the shaman decided, yes, he could now go back to doing some of the things he used to do before Raven was born, and one was taking an afternoon nap. So while Raven was playing with the sun on the floor, the old man kicked back, closed his eyes, and fell asleep. Raven saw his chance as he seized the sun up in his beak, and out through the smoke hole he went. And when he reached the outer world, he opened his beak, and magically the sun returned to the sky exactly where you see it today. So the next time you see Raven, a very misunderstood animal, tell him thank you for bringing back the light. And how do we know the story is true? Because the old people have told us so. In the beginning of time, before there was a calendar, the deer and the wolves were friends. The deer were many, had all the grass and leaves they wanted to eat. But the poor wolves, they only had a few skinny rabbits and tiny mice from the fields, and they were always hungry. So one day the chief of the wolves decided that he was going to bring all his wolves together in council, and they were going to select another animal to eat. Well, the wolves could not agree, and they were arguing. And all of a sudden, went running by the council was a deer. And one of the wolves jumped up and said, "Why don't we eat those deer? There's a lot of them." Well, the chief of the wolves says, "How can we eat our friends?" Well, there are many of them, and besides, they run very fast. And they have sharp hooves, and we don't know what kind of teeth they have. Well, one of the wolves said they eat grass and leaves. They should be flat like the other grass eaters. But the chief said, "We don't know what kind of teeth they have." And they argued and argued and argued. And finally, the chief of the wolves announced that he had a plan. He was going to invite their friends, the deer, to supper. And after they had eaten, he would tell a joke. And when they opened their mouth to laugh, they could see what kind of teeth they had. And if they had those flat, grass-eater teeth, they would eat them. But if they were sharp meat-eaters like them, they would leave them alone. Well, the wolves thought this was a great plan. So the next day, invitations went out to all the deer. And when the chief of the deer received his, he was delighted. He had never sat down to supper together with his friends, the wolves, before. But a little deer mouse that lived with him warned him, "It's a trick, it's a trick. Don't trust those wolves, it's a trick." But the chief of the deer would not hear such a thing. They had been friends since the beginning of time, and he was going to sit down and eat with the wolves. When the night of the great feast arrived, all the deer went to the cave of the chief of the wolves, and along with them that little deer mouse warning him, "Don't trust the wolves, it's a trick. Don't trust the wolves." Well, dinner was perfect for the deer. All the grass and leaves they wanted. But the poor wolves, they only had a few tiny little mice and skinny rabbits. And when dinner was over, their bellies were still empty. Finally, the chief of the wolves stood up and announced, "I am going to tell you a joke." And as he told the joke, that little deer mouse warned all the deer, "Don't show your teeth, it's a trick. Don't show your teeth, they're going to eat you." And all of a sudden, the deer realized this little tiny critter who could fit into the tiniest of all the cracks, who could see all and hear all, was right. This was a trick. So they decided not to laugh. And when the joke was over, the wolves, they roared, "Ah, ha, 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 ha." And the deer just sat there in silence. "You insult me, dear," said the chief of the wolves. "Why aren't you laughing at my joke?" Well, the deer decided they better laugh, but this time, they were going to laugh in a different way. They wouldn't show their teeth. And so they laughed. Oh, that's no way to laugh, said the chief of the wolves. When you laugh, you show your teeth. The deer realized they had no choice. And when they opened their mouth to laugh, the wolves saw those flat, grassy teeth, and they sprang upon them. And the deer, they went running out of the cave. And ever since that night, the deer and wolves have never sat down to supper together. If the deer had anything to say about it. And how do we know the story is true? Because our old people have told us so. Throughout the world, wolves have been given a bad name. In the Northwest, the wolf is a medicine animal. And they say if you believe in the power of the wolf, it will come to you and heal you. Many warriors have said that they were wounded, and the wolf had appeared to them and drew the arrows from their wound. Throughout the world, we always also hear about stories of great floods. There are many such stories here in the Northwest amongst the native people. And this is one of those stories. Now, at the right time, you will know what to do. This is another story you can help me. Oh! 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 The old people say the sky opened up and began to rain. They say it rained so hard and so long that the rivers and the creeks spilled over their banks and flooded the land. And the animals had to climb high into the mountains to escape the rising waters. Soon Wolf found himself on a mountain peak with all these other animals. But when he looked very closely, he realized that there was only one of each kind of animal, not two. And when he told the critters what he saw, they looked around and realized he was right. There was only one of each kind, not two, and they realized without their mates, they would vanish from the face of the world. And they all began to cry. But the wolf, he wouldn't cry. He looked out across this new ocean that had been created by the rain, and he spied a far-off mountain peak, and he wondered, was there life there? And so he called out, "Ow! Ow!" But he was answered by nothing but silence. The animals told him to save his breath, that they were all doomed. But Wolf, he would not give up. He turned to the south and he called out, "Ow! Ow!" And all of a sudden there came a reply. But it was so quiet. None of the animals heard it, and they kept on crying. And so he turned to the west and he called out, "Ow! Ow!" And once again there came a reply. But once again, it was so quiet. None of those animals heard it, and they kept on crying. So he turned to the north and he called out, "Ow! Ow!" This time, he heard a loud reply. Now, some of those animals heard it, and they stopped their crying. But others, they kept bawling their eyes out. So he called out to the east, "Ow! Ow!" And once again there came a loud reply. This time, all the animals heard it, and they stopped their crying. So they patiently waited till the rain stopped, and the waters receded, and then they made their way down into the valleys, and there they went and found their mates. So we can thank the wolf, a very misunderstood animal, for giving those creatures the courage to go on, because if they had given up, we would not have animals in the world today, and what a terrible place it would be to live without these great creatures. And of course, we know the story has to be true because the old people have told us so. High in the mountains are the best huckleberries. When you go into the high country, you cannot help but to feel that there are things here that you can't see and maybe don't understand, but they are here. You know, so much time has passed. Nobody really knows just how much time it really has been, but at least 14,000 years. The native people have lived here by themselves without the whites. When the whites came, there was much change. And one of the things people have lost is some of the very, very old stories and the ceremonies that they used to do. In the high country, the people were said to return and burn the fields of huckleberries so that there would no be competing growth from the other vegetation. And lots of people, when you ask them how they did this, no one remembers. One night, it's been about 2 decades ago now, I got a knock on my door, and there was Sylvia Walulutum from Warm Springs, one of the elders who had been working with us on some sacred lands work. She said, my van had broken down. Can I use your phone? So I let her use my phone and realized that her van wasn't going anyplace that night. So I said, I'll take you home. And she said, no, you don't have to take me all the way to Warm Springs. I said, sure, I'll take you to Warm Springs. Then she wanted to pay me for gas, and I said, no, I'm not going to charge my friend money to take her home. And she says, okay. Since you are a storyteller, I'm going to tell you stories all the way to Warm Springs. And I thought, wow, I'm getting the better end of the deal. And for over an hour, she told me stories. And then she said, do you have anything you want to ask me? And I said, yes. How did they burn the huckleberry fields? And she said, this is how they did it. And this is what she told me. When they left Warm Springs, the children had to be very quiet, could not make any unnecessary noises. The horses they were riding also had to be quiet. If the horses were noisy, or if the children were noisy, the ceremony was over, because the ceremony began when they left the village. Immediately. And if things went right, if everybody was quiet, when they reached the mountains, like a place named Enola Hill just above rhododendron, they would go into the fields and still everyone would be quiet. One of the men would go to the far side of the field and set it on fire. And they all waited quietly, not saying a word. And as the fire burned itself across the huckleberry fields, ready to enter the forests, everyone started to scream and yell, and they say the sky would open up and began to rain. Sometimes it began to snow and would put the fire out. The fires in those huckleberry fields would never leave the fields as long as that ceremony was done properly and everyone was quiet. And then she turned to me and said, what the story is telling you is that there's a time to be quiet and a time to be noisy. And that's the way it was when I was a little girl. I want to conclude with a story that comes from along the Columbia River. Have you ever wondered why people do what they do and sometimes never give up? And they really should give up because they're not going anywhere. And life is hard, but they don't give up. This is one of those stories. There was once a man who spent all his time looking at the sky, watching the birds. And the birds he loved the most were the swans. And one day he announced to everyone else who would listen to him that he wanted to become a swan. And the people laughed at him. They said, "You can't become a swan, you're a man. And you can't fly." So the man went out and he waited for the great swans to return from their winter feeding grounds. And in the spring, he went amongst them and gathered all their feathers he could find and made himself 2 wings. And in the autumn, when they were ready to leave and go back to their winter feeding grounds, he climbed up to a mountain and he waited. When the great swans filled the sky, he jumped off the mountain and fell to the ground and crashed, broke his wings. The people called him crazy. No man can fly and no man's going to turn into a swan. But he didn't give up. He rebuilt his wings with feathers that were even stronger. And he waited for the great swans to return. And once again in the spring, he went amongst them, learned their ways, listened, asked questions. And in the autumn, he climbed up to a taller mountain and he waited. And when all the swans' wings had filled the sky, he leaped off that mountain and fell to the ground like a rock. Once again, he broke his wings, but he didn't give up. The people said that he was crazy. He should learn his lesson, but he won't listen. He won't give up. He has to be crazy. So he rebuilt his wings, and once again, when the swans returned, he went amongst them. And once again, he learned all he could, and then climbed up to a tall mountain. And once again, when their great wings filled the fall skies, he fell to the ground. But he didn't give up. He rebuilt his wings. When they returned again, he was ready for them. He learned as much as he possibly could. And then he climbed up to the tallest mountain he could find. And when the great swans left for their winter feeding grounds, he leaped over that mountain. The wind caught his wings, and he flew up with the swans, and off they went. In the spring, when the swans returned, the man was with them. And that's the way it was. Every time the swans left, the man would leave, and he would return. One day when the swans came back, the man was no longer with them. Some people say he was shot out of the sky by an angry hunter, but others say that this man had gained so much power that he now sat in the sky world as their chief, their Tehi. So the next time you see someone doing something you don't understand, another person turning into a swan. And how do we know the story is true? Because the old people have told us so. Thank you. We wanted to give you another perspective about the Huckleberry Festival. You know, the Huckleberry Festival started in 1890 when Samuel Welch, an Oregon Trail pioneer and founder of the village of Welch's, decided to celebrate the opening of his new hotel. It was a modified two-story farmhouse. And decided to celebrate not just that, but Mount Hood and its history and its natural resources. And he wanted people to remember the native people who really had the very first Huckleberry Festival. People that was misunderstood. And so he started the Huckleberry Festival. Many years later, during the Great Depression, the festival died. And there was nothing for people to celebrate, they said. In the mid-1980s, we decided to bring it back. And thanks to the granddaughter of Samuel Welch, she gave us a lot of insight to who this man was and why this festival was important. And this is our 25th year. We started out with a table in a parking lot, and it was a very small table. I remember that. And a couple gallons of huckleberries, because people just, for some reason, decided huckleberries no longer grew on Mount Hood. And that was a myth. They said it didn't grow. So 25 years later, we are here today. When we look back for 25 years, it's not just happiness I see. We have lost a lot of natural resources. We have lost a lot of historical sites. We have lost a lot of cultural sites. This last year, we lost a very important burial ground of the native people that were tied to a very, very old trail, a native trail that became known as the Oregon Trail. And all those immigrant sites that were tied together were lost together. We lost a great deal. The people who return to that site today, and incidentally can't even park on the highway anymore or at a nearby federal park because you'll be towed away. So really unable to even visit this desecrated site, to even pay the respects even that way. But looking forward, we have to learn from all this ignorance and see what we're going to take care of for future generations. So for the next 25 years, maybe we can look back and say, we didn't lose too much, that people were really educated. And that's what the Huckleberry really represents. It represents the past, it represents life today, and it represents the future. And we can use the Huckleberry as an important gauge for what's happening to our heritage. And if the Huckleberry can survive those great fields of berries that the Indian people took so good of care of, who did their ceremonies to make sure we would always have the huckleberries, if we can make them survive, then we have hope. We have to have hope. And thank God we still do, in spite of what has happened.
I'm here to say a prayer. There's also going to be some huckleberries that are going to be given out to each of you, if you would like. We'll partake as a group in sharing this beautiful berry. So when you receive your huckleberry, don't eat it yet. We're all going to eat it at the same time. I just have a few things to say. My grandparents actually picked huckleberries up here on Mount Hood, and we could see Mount Hood from my grandparents' pasture and farm on the other side, near St. Helens. But we could look out and we could see the mountain. And I always thought, what a perfect place. And I always had wished that I had been able to come up here and pick berries with my grandparents. So this for me feels like a homecoming. My flute friends have tried for maybe 2 or 3 years to get me to come here, and I'm very grateful to be here. The other story that I have relates to the Huckleberry, and that I fixed some drums. I'm a drum maker and a fan maker, and I fixed several drums for a Puyallup family. And they said, well, how much do I owe you? And I said, well, I don't know. I said, I don't want any money. And so they went to the freezer and they got out some smoked salmon and they gave me a gallon bag of frozen huckleberries. And that was like gold to them, and I knew it. And I was very happy and very grateful. So, Creator, Tankashla, we give thanks this day. We give thanks to the huckleberry. We give thanks to the elders. We give thanks to this place, the ancestors who have protected the huckleberry. We ask that you watch over us in this time. We ask that you help us. It doesn't matter if you're native or not. If you feel called to help save the huckleberry, get busy. We can all do something. So I ask you now to honor the huckleberry at this gathering, a gathering of friends, a gathering of relatives, and help us share stories, help us create community in this here and this now. Aho. So remember, you're going to wait to eat your berries, right? Is it just us?
So now we all take part?
We do? I thought the audience got some too.
They do.
Oh, yeah, they've already got them.
I already got them.
Okay. Let's honor the huckleberry. Aho. Many blessings.
We'd like for you to stay here for a couple of minutes. We have a surprise for Mike. And, well, just close your eyes, Mike. You're the girls. Okay, we're ready for the surprise for Mike.
Yeah, they're coming. Did you peek it?
The surprise is we've got a real big bill for Mike.
Well, my friend, you can open your eyes. We have another gift for our friend. Oh my God. You're kidding me.
Mike's been eyeing this bonnet and breastplate all weekend. We lied to him. We told him it was sold. So now it's his. I don't know if you're aware of it. Mike's building a little museum, and this is going to be one of the centerpieces. So that's what it's for.
You achieved our goal. You're speechless.
Storyteller without words.
I had heard about this tremendous artist who made these wonderful things, this man here, and saw this incredible piece of work that was needed to be shared with a lot of people, and told people that that could be our centerpiece in our museum because of what it represented. And when I heard it was sold, I just kind of cringed because it was another piece going into a private collection.
John was so gracious to John was so gracious to allow us to wheel and deal and trade and purchase for this. So without him and him obtaining this beautiful thing, this would not have taken place. So John Ely.